This is my first Chinese book recommendation video, and it's about the three-body problem. Hi, you're watching Avenue X, where a junkie on good stories shares their thoughts, knowledge, and occasional weird ideas on stories and how they're told. I sometimes get comments under my videos talking about what books do I read or do I have any books that I want to recommend. And I thought, why not? Why not just make my first ever video about recommending a Chinese book? In general, I don't really want to recommend Chinese books that you can't read in Chinese language. There are a lot of great Chinese literature pieces, whether it's poetry or novel, but the problem with the language is it is just so far from English. Here I'm talking about English translations. And most of the time, however good the book is translated, when you read the English version, it just takes out too much of the actual meaning and original sort of richness of the language and the cultural sort of implication behind the words. But the three-body problem is an exception. It is the type of books where plot, where concepts, where the story itself is more important than the language it is written in. So even though it's translated into English, maybe in other languages, you still be able to enjoy it very much. I have to confess I'm not a big sci-fi fan, and the three-body problem is not arguably, it's definitely the most famous sci-fi novel that's ever come out of China. It won the 2015 Hugo Award of Best Book, which is the most important and prestigious book award out there for sci-fis. If you actually haven't heard of these books, I highly recommend you buy these books. Read them. The English translations are very good. There are 3 books in this series. First one is The Three-Body Problem, the second is The Dark Forest, and the third is Death End. The reason for me to recommend these books, these series of books to my audiences, if you haven't read them, is because it really is a fantastic story. Usually when you see a very successful sci-fi story, you have one big concept, and your story and your character sort of evolves around that. Whereas this series of books just contains so many insane concepts. And if you love fast-pacing stories, you love solving mysteries, you love ginormous surprise being constantly just dumped on your head, this would be the books to go. I have to confess, I read to the sort of middle of the second book and I didn't continue reading it. I found out all the details and plot later, but I didn't read it because while the story is extremely interesting, it's also extremely depressing, in my opinion, because it depicts a universe that is just the coldest, the cruelest, the most hopeless version that you can imagine. Or I never imagined, I should say, because before reading this book, I never really thought of the universe as this. Three-Body Problem series is a very hard core sci-fi. It's hard sci-fi. It doesn't write on the beauty of the language, the linguistic pleasure you get, or even great characterizations of the main lead characters. All the characters are tools, are just tools to deliver the plots, to deliver this picture of this crazy universe that we live in, or at least the author's version of the universe. It happens to be really the worst version that you can imagine. It opened up my mind, although I don't agree, and I certainly don't want to believe the universe would be in any way like the version that the writer Liu Cixin describes in this book. I appreciate the incredible mind and eye-opening descriptions of the possibilities of the crazy science and the crazy rules of the entire universe. Maybe it's my personal bias that I've always thought about life and existence in a more benign and kind and hopefully more spiritual way. But I do find this very survival is the most important thing version of universe equally exhilarating and exciting. And I wouldn't want to live in this kind of universe, but I enjoy reading a story about it. I think it's very stimulating. If you don't know about this writer, he's very interesting. He's extremely low-key. He's not even on social media. He doesn't have Weibo. He doesn't have WeChat. He lives in a tiny town of a tiny city that you need to just travel in very difficult and long rides of buses that nobody takes to get to where he lives. And he writes a lot of his stuff while he was, no longer now, but he used to be actually an electrical engineer in a very small hydro power plant. And he wrote his books while he has nothing to do, because his job was basically just sitting in the control room and waiting for things to go wrong in the hydro plant. If something happens, he goes to fix it. And if nothing happens, he just sits there hours every day. That's just keeping an eye on things. So when he has nothing to do, he just have a very old computer and he starts to type his sci-fi novels. And he created his Hugo Award world-renowned book under that condition. And he still lives in a very reclusive way these days. I find that's extremely interesting. It kind of shows you your imagination really is more important than the outside factors. Another very important reason I want to recommend these books is, apart from its crazy scientific sort of sci-fi side of the story, it really is a very accurate, heartbreaking in many ways depiction of the dark side of humanity, about how people come after each other, how humans seem to never really learn from our mistakes, generations after generations. When you are thrown into certain crazy situations, you see how the mass reacts. It never really improves. On a deeper level, this writer really gets to the really uncomfortable parts and the darkest parts, and using his very cold, very scientific, almost surgical way of looking at humanity. This book can also be read as a commentary or criticism on humanity, and I find that is also extremely powerful. Painful to read sometimes, painful to realize, but also like, yeah, it really is like that. And I appreciate a sci-fi writer who doesn't romanticize the really bad parts of humanity and just put it right in your face in the most unembellished way. I would suggest, if you pick up this book, do stick with it after the first two chunks. So first you will see a sort of video game and murder investigation that happens, and then it will lead to a section that seems to be completely irrelevant. It goes to 1970s during Chinese Cultural Revolution, about a female physicist and her very horrendous experience. And you may just not really get it at the point when you read it. It was like, why is it dragging on talking about irrelevant that has no sci-fi in it? If you're reading that and you have doubts, just stick with the story. Once you've gone over the Cultural Revolution section, you will understand why it exists, because that's the part where it starts everything. It's the beginning of the butterfly effects that leads to every sci-fi crazy things that happened in this book. And it's absolutely necessary. And when you've read the book and you go back and you would think this is the best origin version that you can think for this kind of story. So if you're reading this book and you have problems and you don't quite understand why it is like this at the beginning, just stick with it. I guarantee you, once you go over that, you will enjoy the rest of the story. So I'll talk very briefly about the plot now. So if you don't want to be spoiled, absolutely not at all, then you should stop watching here, and I'll let you know when you should come back. So the first book's title, The Three-Body Problem, explains a civilization that exists about 4 light years away from our planet. A very unfortunate planet that gets trapped in this gravity pull between 3 stars. So in their system, there are 3 stars. And in physics, I'm not a physicist, but basically there's something called three-body problem. Is when you have those 3 masses orbiting around each other, it's impossible to predict as a planet how you would get pulled by those stars. So it creates this really harsh environment for the civilization to survive on this planet, that they get suddenly flourish and then they get suddenly too cold or too hot and they get destroyed. But this very persistent life form managed to survive hundreds and thousands of rounds of distinction and rebirth. And they realize they have to leave their planet because one day it will be swallowed by the 3 suns. So they're looking for places to move to. Whereas in the Cultural Revolution, China, this lady who suffered very painful personal loss gets kind of exiled to a very cold and lonely place in the forests, in the mountains in northeast China. And she completely lost faith in humanity, and rightfully so because of her horrendous experience. But she's also a scientist, and she gets assigned to this place that has this weird satellite. And she later finds out this is a base for discovering alien lives that the government set up. And because of her genius, she managed to use the sun as a magnifier kind of thing to send out a radio signal into the universe, declaring humans where we are in the universe. And she gets a message back from the three-body civilization. And the person who sent her the message tells her, don't let us know where you are. Because the next time you send out a signal, we're going to be able to pinpoint where you are, and we're coming for you, and we will destroy your planet and take over. Because they have really much more powerful sort of scientific advancement, equipment and knowledge than us. But the lady, because she basically doesn't have hope for humanity, she sends out the signal anyway. And that leads to immigration from the three-body planet and the threat of planet Earth, and all the crazy things that will happen in book 1, book 2, and book 3. Eventually you get to the point at the very end where the entire universe existence is coming to an end, or it will be reset. And because of one particular person's, I don't know, human weakness, it may just result in the completely annihilation of our universe. But the book doesn't tell you. It doesn't really explain what happened. It just ends right before the sort of, did the universe get reset, or did it just get itself destroyed? You don't know about that. So this is a crazy ride that you see one thing leads to another, and bigger and more crazy concepts keeps happening, but it's still very reasonable within the setup of the story. And you see how generations of human reacts to all these crazy things. At the very end, you just had this huge dose of vastness of existence on the entire universe scale. You do feel, as an individual person, life is so fragile and small, and the universe in this version is just so cold and cruel. That's why I really didn't have the heart to go through the entire book, sentence by sentence. But I think it's brilliant. In the most cruel way, it's brilliant. One funny thing I have heard, I don't know if it's actually true, is actually Obama is a huge fan of this series. He read the first 2 translation books, but the third book didn't get translated yet or published at the time he read the first 2, and he couldn't wait. So he basically used his presidential power to get the manuscript of translation and read that first, I think, before any English speakers in the world. I remembered he did that with Game of Thrones somehow as well. So it just shows you these are really entertaining and very interesting books to read. So if you haven't read this book, highly recommend. Very entertaining and mind-opening and eye-opening. And it's on everywhere. Just search Liu Cixin, the writer's name, or just Three-Body Problem, and you will see all 3 books. I would suggest just get 3 books in one go, because I don't see how you can stop wanting to read it after the end of the first book. You would just jump into the second one. Thank you for watching Avenue X first ever book recommendation video. I'll see you in my next video. Meanwhile, live long and happy book reading.